Cast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to the April Community IT Innovators webinar. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar in which we release and announce the 2020 Nonprofit Cybersecurity Incident Report. My name is Johan Hammerstrom, and I'm the President and CEO of Community IT and the moderator for this series. Before we begin, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about our company. Community IT is a 100% employee-owned company. Our team of almost 40 staff is dedicated to helping nonprofit organizations advance their missions through the effective use of technology. We're technology experts, and we have been consistently named a top 501 managed services provider, an honor that we received in 2019 as well. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, our Chief Technology Officer, Matthew Eshleman. Good afternoon, Matt.
Hey, good afternoon, Johan. Thanks for hosting the webinar today. And thanks to everyone who's taking some time out of their day to join me as we go and talk about some of the unique security challenges that are facing nonprofit organizations and how we can best combat that. Also in this unique situation that we find ourselves in with everybody that can doing remote work, we'll also have some time to talk a little bit about good practices for secure remote work. So I would ask you to please use the questions feature to chat in your answers. We will have some time for Q&A at the end. Johan can also moderate, and if there's anything that we need to talk about on a specific slide, we'll be able to address those questions as they come up. So thanks again for joining today. And as we get started, I'd like to go ahead and just get a little bit of a sense of our audience today and see, of the attendees, who has a plan to improve cybersecurity at their organization. So go ahead and just, we'll get a quick poll to see where folks are at with improving cybersecurity at their organization. You can see if you're, just underway, wait on approval, we're already just at the beginning getting started, or not yet. So thanks for chatting that in. We'll leave it open here for just another second or two. So thanks for responding. So it looks like most of the attendees today are underway. And some folks are getting started, and the rest haven't started yet. So again, I think you'll be in good place. I think there'll be something for everybody who's attending here. So let's go ahead and get one more question. So maybe this is more applicable to the folks that have said that they are underway. I was curious to see where folks are at with their budget for cybersecurity, either coming into the year, for organizations that are starting on that July 1 fiscal date. How's your budget changed? Is it increased, decreased, flat, or perhaps you're in the category where there's no money allocated for cybersecurity? So I'm watching the numbers come in. So we'll leave it open here for another few seconds. You can see where you're at compared with your peers here on it. So it looks like most folks are flat, some increased, and but a significant chunk has no money allocated for cybersecurity. So again, there are some things that you can do that are very low cost or already included with some of the tools you have. So all is not doom and gloom here. So thanks for that response. We'll have another poll a little bit later on. So keep your ears open for that. So let's go ahead and get right into the next slide where we talk about the incident report. So I'm happy to announce that this is our second edition. So last year we did our first cybersecurity report where we took a look at all the data collected from service tickets submitted by our clients. So we're a managed service provider based in Washington, D.C. We support about 120 organizations that represent about 5,000 endpoints. So we maintain an ITIL compliant service desk, and so we categorize all the incidents as they come in. So we have a good handle on the types of security issues that are facing nonprofit organizations that have between 10 and 500 staff. So this represents the second year of that data collection, and so we can start to see some trends emerge associated with the security incidents that our clients are facing. So again, there's a little bit of a bias in here in terms of being applied to organizations probably in the DC metro area, but I think there's things that can be extrapolated regardless of your geographic location. So let's take a look at our agenda, where we will talk about the overall cybersecurity landscape. I think it's always a good idea to just get level set to kind of understand the operating environment that we are in. We'll talk a little bit about remote work. I know that's on the minds of many of you as you're supporting staff that are working from from their homes or other remote locations. And then we'll talk a little bit about our approach to cybersecurity, which I think it helps to inform some of the information that we have, and then we'll go drill into the types of incidents that we see, and then the report data, and then wrap it up talking about some steps that you can take to secure your organization. So we'll take a look at that for our agenda today. So let's talk about the cybersecurity landscape that we are operating in. I think there's a couple of things that we know, regardless of the type of organization that you represent. And one is that there's just persistent and ongoing brute force attacks on our online identities. And I think the shift to the cloud has been a positive one overall. I think it does give us a lot more insight in terms of what's going on, in terms of how our networks are being attacked, or our online identities being attacked. So again, if you're an Office 365 client, there's a rich amount of data in Azure AD to see the number of failed login attempts that are coming and which which accounts are being targeted. So we can just see that any system that's connected to the internet is just receiving constant brute force attacks. We're also seeing sophisticated spear phishing that proclaims to be your executive director, the finance director. The bad guys are really good at going to your website and figuring out the relationships amongst your staff, and then using that information to target them to get account information or commit financial fraud, and we'll see that in the data we have. We also know that organizations are targeted because of the work they do. And we'll look at some of the trends that we see, but policy think tank groups tend to be targeted by foreign state actors, and we see that in the data amongst the clients that we see. And then we also know that attacks are targeting vendors such as ourselves. So as a managed service provider, we have credentials for many different networks, and so we take the integrity of that data very seriously. And we know from the FBI and other cyber reports that malicious actors are targeting vendors as a way to exploit one network and then access many more. So that's kind of the environment that we're at. And if we take a look at the next slide, then we can also see that, let's go back to the other, there's the other landscape here. And we'll talk about the new security tools that are available. It's not all bad news. There do seem to be good tools available for cybersecurity. And so I think that's a positive thing. And I think also on the positive side, we are seeing organizations are being more proactive about asking where to start with improving their cybersecurity. So again, I think that's evidenced by the attendance here today. Folks are really interested in what they can do. And we also know that from the Microsoft nonprofit cybersecurity report that there's a long way to go. So in their data, 60% of nonprofit organizations don't know how their organization handles cybersecurity risks. So, I think we have a link, we can chat that out from Microsoft and their report data, I think, which has some really interesting findings, but, it does highlight that nonprofit organizations in general haven't prioritized cybersecurity and still have a long way to go when it comes to, I think, defining the risk and defining the processes in place. And then there's also some data points. Cybersecurity can be expensive to remediate. So again, if there's a breach, this is from a Kaspersky study, but a breach response for small to mid-sized business is $149,000, and that's actually direct costs. So that's costs associated for legal, for maybe incident response from a vendor, costs associated with defending from lawsuits. So again, breach response can be an expensive proposition for organizations to take on. So there are some pretty significant direct costs associated with responding to security breaches. So let's see, before we start talking about this remote work, let's go ahead and I'm just get a poll here to see how your organization has been handling the shift to remote work. I'll leave this up for a second here. All right. So thanks for the responses there. And great, I'm really glad to see the responses there, that most organizations have had tools in place already and that it's going well. Another chunk had to scramble, and then a small percentage of folks who required physical presence or are still working on getting things in place. So I think that has kind of mirrored our experiences as well. We kind of were already a virtual organization largely, and so the shift to all remote work from a technology standpoint hasn't been hard. I think the other things around it make it challenging, but from a technical perspective, the tools have been in place and we're doing well. And I think a number of the organizations that we have supported, we're also in that boat, having shifted to a primarily cloud-first approach, laptop-centric computing, and that I think has really been beneficial with this shift and transition. I do think it does bring up some more challenges, especially if the shift has been more reactive. I do think that overall management and reporting is harder to do. Perhaps if you're already working with an MSP, they may already have the tools in place. We have a system that manages, all the endpoints, make sure that antivirus is deployed, system updates are happening, inventory has been taken, software, security updates are being applied. So it doesn't matter for us whether your computer's in your office or at home, we're able to make sure that it's up to date. That may not always be the case. I do think that there's some significant security risks that do come up with remote work to open up security holes. Again, this is, I would say, primarily be applied to organizations where staff are now using personal computers to access work resources. And again, you don't have that same sense of control in terms of, is the computer up to date? Do they have their antivirus protection? What else is going on that system? And can you, report and audit on that data? So I think that there are some things to, to kind of be aware of as it relates to that. I think, home internet connections, I think, there's some potential risk there, although I think working from home is actually probably a more secure proposition than, connecting from the public Wi-Fi in a coffee shop. So, I think there are some security holes that are not insurmountable. And I think they primarily have to do with device management. And so having tools in place, again, for device management and a mobile device management policy as well, so that you can ensure that the organizations that are connecting to and accessing and storing and downloading information from your organization's information systems is secure. So again, for those organizations that have already worked with an MSP partner or rolled out Intune or some other MDM solution, you're in a much better place because you can have that accountability for the systems that are being used to access the organizational data. And then finally, proactive planning pays off. As I mentioned, organizations, are largely already in the cloud for most of their primary email systems. Organizations, we've seen a pretty seismic shift to laptops away from desktops. So again, that makes remote work a lot easier. And so that proactive planning, the organizations that had the IT policy in place, that made the transitions, that were able to put those technologies in place to support a more flexible work environment, are now able to I think take advantage of that and be as productive as possible during these challenging times. So let's talk about the most popular topic of the day, which is around secure video conferencing. I would say, and we have some resources available on our website that talk about secure remote work tips, and then we'll drop some links about if you really want to geek out on some of these topics, we can send those links out as well. And I would say, in general, organizations already have secure tools available to them. You're either in Microsoft with Office 365, in which case you have Microsoft Teams, which is a secure video chat platform amongst many other features that it has. Or if you're in the G Suite world, you have Google Meet, Google Hangout as another secure option. So for most organizations, those tools are already in place. They may not be as user-friendly as Zoom, but I think they provide, kind of the core functionality that most organizations need to be productive, stay engaged with colleagues and, external partners as well. So, if you're already in that world, you can use those tools. And we've actually had conversations with a number of organizations that had been using Zoom that are now needing to pull that back because of some security concerns and basically rediscovering the tools that they already have available to them. So again, Microsoft Teams or Google Meet, that's already in the stack for most organizations. If organizations do have significant privacy and security concerns, I think that may outstrip even what you can get with Teams or Google. Then there's some zero-knowledge encryption platforms that will provide secure end-to-end communication, and so that could be Wire. So I think that's a Swiss company that provides video group chat with end-to-end encryption. Signal is another popular tool. It is just a voice calling or a chat platform. And then another one is called Jitsi. I think it's supported by 8x8, but is another encrypted solution that can support those organizations that have significant concerns related to the integrity of their communications. And this is mostly talking about traffic being intercepted on the way to or from the endpoint. Whenever we talk about Zoom, I think Zoom has been under the microscope lately. I think there have been some notable security vulnerabilities within the platform itself that I think have been, addressed in terms of, vulnerabilities with passwords being potentially sent out. If people were being sent a malicious link, or a couple months ago, there was an issue where they were, deploying a web server on Mac computers to, automatically launch and share video. So those kind of endpoint or application level issues have been largely addressed. In some of the links that one of the links that we can send out, I think there are some concerns around their implementation of their encryption and how they're using certificates and how they're routing traffic that organizations that have a high, degree of privacy or sensitivity in their communications may want to avoid for that reason. But I think for most organizations, the biggest concern with using a tool, like Zoom is, just kind of malicious actors exploiting some of the weaknesses in the overall design related to, meetings that were, not restricted with a password, or, we saw, the British government, the Prime Minister was on a Zoom meeting and they had the meeting ID, on a public tweet, so there are some good practices to keep the meeting integrity of Zoom intact so that you don't get hassled by Zoom bombers that are coming in and just kind of causing havoc by exploiting some, just kind of usability weaknesses in the platform. So again, if you are, the functionality within Zoom, it's certainly easy to use. I think it does the best job of, kind of video sharing for a lot of users. But I think there's some, there are weaknesses related to how they've implemented their encryption and certificate management that could be a concern. But I think the largest concerns that are impacting most organizations are just how do you make sure that the meeting is secure? How can you control the meeting attendees and make sure that, the people that need to have access to the meeting, do have access to the meeting. All right, so we'll go ahead and just make a shift now to talk a little bit about our approach to cybersecurity, and then get into the data itself. So community IT, we use this graphic to talk a little bit about how we view cybersecurity, building on a foundation of security policy, and then on top of that, talking about security awareness. So recognizing that kind of the first two building blocks are really policy and people related. It's not, the technology isn't the ultimate goal here. There are elements around technology controls related to identity, protecting the data, protecting the devices, your network perimeter, which now is everybody's home, home personal computer, the web, and then layered on top with some predictive intelligence tools. So again, that's a graphic that we just use as a lens to make sure that we are covering our bases and representing that these things are rooted in a foundation of security policy. And then also we can talk about our security practices that we have at Community IT. So for all of the, those 5,000 endpoints that I talked about, we're managing operating system updates, we're managing third-party patching, we are deploying not only, kind of the operating system level updates, but for Windows computers, we're also doing BIOS and driver level updates. And that's kind of a side effect or an outcome of the Spectre Meltdown vulnerabilities that were identified a couple of years ago. But again, we want to make sure the whole stack is updated. We all are also deploying antivirus to all systems, and then also implementing web filtering as an additional security layer. So again, those are the pieces that we think are important to have in place on every machine. And that helps to keep the computers that we support up to date and secure. So now let's talk a little bit about definitions before we actually get into the data. We call this the Nonprofit Cybersecurity Incident Report because we want to talk about the actual events that potentially compromise the integrity, confidentiality, or availability of an information asset. So these are just kind of issues that get reported to us, and then we investigate. So incident is kind of the the top of the funnel, and then the next slide we talk about breach and the definition of a breach. So a breach is an incident that results in the confirmed disclosure, not just the potential exposure like we have with an incident of data to an unauthorized party. So you'll see in the data that we have, we're talking about security incidents. Those need to be investigated, and then some percentage of those security incidents do turn into a confirmed breach, which is much more serious kind of categorization. So just from a definitional perspective, we have incidents and then we have breaches. And obviously we want to minimize both, but the breach is the more serious of the two. So the types of incidents that we classify in our system, there's 9 in total. And so, starting off with what we see the most of, which is spam. I think we're all familiar with that. Then we talk about malware, which is, again, kind of a generic classification with any type of malicious software. What we see it is it's usually reported by the end user as, a slow computer or strange pop-ups. That type of thing gets classified as malware. We talk about account compromise, which is the unauthorized use of a digital identity by someone other than the assigned user. Again, so if you have a confirmed account compromise, it could constitute a data breach. And then moving on, talk about business email compromise. Sometimes that's also called spear phishing. These terms are evolving a bit. And that's, a scam where they are using, you'll see it as, faking the name of your executive director or your finance director in order to, extract funds, buy gift cards, update wire transfer information, provide data, list of employees, that kind of thing would be considered business email compromise or spear phishing. We classify wire fraud, which is kind of often the result of a business email compromise attack where they are actually stealing money using phone lines or electronic communications. We have a virus, which is more specialized term or narrow definition of malware. It's a malicious piece of software that can alter the way the computer works and then spread from one computer to another. So, and then finally, we'll wrap up with a supply chain attack. So that could be an attack that's initiated through a partner of an organization, also known as value chain to third party. So again, as a managed service provider, we could be a target for this type of attack. As a nonprofit organization, you could also be involved in a supply chain attack where, somebody compromises an account in your organization, and then that's used to pivot to target other partner organizations or board members. So that would be an example of a supply chain attack. We have a definition for advanced persistent threat, or APT. And so that's really a state-sponsored actor that's trying to get, information on an organization. So again, their goal, as opposed to kind of getting in and being disruptive, their goal is to kind of get in, maintain persistence, observe, see what's going on, and exfiltrate data over a long period of time. And then finally, we have ransomware, crypto, where it's again a more specialized form of a virus that's used to encrypt data and then demand payment so that the data can be decrypted and used. So that's the incident classifications that we operate from. And I know from some of the comments that have come in, many people are experiencing spam and the business email compromise or spear phishing attacks, with a few of the account compromises and ransomware attacks thrown in. So let's go ahead and take a look at the data we have here. Great. So in this table, where we talk about our cybersecurity incidents, you can see that they're classified by incident type. We have a count of incidents, the count of samples, so that would be the number of unique organizations that experienced it, and then a percentage of how many of that sample size experienced the incident. So of the clients we supported, we had 72 different organizations submit in security incidents. So that's a little bit of a classification. And you can see by far the most common security incident is related to spam. And that's probably not a surprise. I'm surprised it's not maybe 100%, but spam is the most common type of attack, with over 70% of our the clients are submitting issues, classifying that. Malware is the second most common attack that we see. You'll kind of notice down in the virus level, which is a couple lines down, is that we actually only had 3 viruses amongst our sample, in 2019. So, 50 gets classified as malware, only 3 viruses out of the lot. So, the actual number of kind of malicious software that gets installed is very low in our sample size. I think that's a little bit, that's probably lower than industry average because of the focus that we have on, managing updates, having antivirus installed, keeping that up to date, really focusing on the fundamentals. But again, so we see that, malware is common, at least commonly reported. The number of actual kind of viruses that are detected is relatively low. The one, the number 3 on the list related to account compromise is the thing that is a very serious risk in my view, because it represents the loss of control. So again, this would be an instance where the somebody other than the named user has had access to that system, and then they've had access to usually an individual's email. Maybe they've accessed other files or resources on the network, and so we can see while we had 15 instances of that over in 2019, that's still 17% of those clients reporting security issues have had a compromised account, which we'll see a little bit in the next slide, the comparison, but again is a high number, and I think a reflection of the fact that most organizations still have not implemented multi-factor authentication as a way to protect themselves against these types of attacks. Fourth on the list is business email compromise or spear phishing. We've actually had 59 of those incidents that we classified last year, which is a relatively large proportion, and we'll see represents a big change over the data from 2018. Wire fraud, again, a relatively small amount, although that can actually represent a significant financial loss to organizations. And again, these are things where people are essentially tricked out of buying gift cards, sending a wire transfer to somebody that it didn't belong to, that kind of a thing. We talked about viruses already, and then we had one case where we had an advanced persistent threat, and those are the types of incidents where we're often working in conjunction with some 3-letter agencies to work on addressing and remediating those issues. And we did not have any supply chain attacks or instances of ransomware in 2019. So again, I think more broadly, and in the report we talk about, ransomware has been particularly impactful for state and local governments. I live in Baltimore. The city of Baltimore was knocked out for a couple of weeks because of a ransomware attack. Atlanta as well, and so ransomware in general does seem to be on the rise. But in the again, the network sample that we have, we didn't quite see that. That may change coming into 2020, but for now, we don't have any ransomware attacks in the network that we manage. And we'll take a look here as we compare year over year. So the orange is 2018 data, and then the blue is 2019 data. So we can see that there was a pretty big spike in the amount of spam reported, and I would say that it's just that it's probably reported spam. I don't think the amount of spam email necessarily has changed, but I think one thing that we've been doing as part of our proactive engagement is just making sure that we're communicating with the clients that we work with. If you have a suspicious email, send it in the help desk. We'll take a look at it. It's a lot easier to get somebody else to take a look at it in 15 minutes and get back to you, than kind of clicking on something yourself, or just trying to do that analysis. So again, I think this is more reflective of proactive engagement with our client base as opposed to an actual increase in spam. But you can see it shows up as a dramatic increase in the amount of security incidents that we're responding to. Not much change in malware. 50 couple, 54, 2018, 50 in 2019. I think that number is holding steady, some small decrease. And then we come to spear phishing or business email compromise, which has had just a huge increase. We started to see this, looking back in the data, kind of at the tail end of 2018, and then in 2019, it just really took off in terms of the number of emails that clients were reporting in, saying, "Hey, I got this from my executive director. This doesn't seem right," and it does seem to be able to evade, traditional spam filtering solutions. And so, we've invested in new tools to be able to combat this. And I think, even though people get a ton of spam, most folks kind of treat it as an annoyance and are able to ignore it, whereas the spear phishing or business email compromise messages really elicit a different response. I mean, people feel kind of personally targeted whenever they're getting that message from their finance director, executive director, asking them to do something. So again, we've invested in a separate tool that's specifically designed to combat this. In response to having such a dramatic increase in the amount of these spear phishing attacks that go out there. So this is, I think, something that's requires a lot of attention and really addresses one of the big pain points that most organizations feel whenever they're dealing with security incidents. And then the other categories here, viruses, 1 in 3, it's hard to, it's a big number, 200%. In absolutes, it's not that much. Ransomware, again, we have 0 and 0, and then we see we have did have a decrease overall in the number of compromised accounts from 2018 to 2019. I think it's still too high, and I will say of the 15 accounts that were compromised, 0 of them had multi-factor authentication enabled. So I think it is a real testament to how effective MFA is as a security control piece. For those of you that have 0 cybersecurity budget, MFA is an included feature in Office 365, in Dropbox, and G Suite. So most mainline computer applications have this as a feature, and it needs to be turned on. Advanced persistent threats. We continue to deal with these at a very small level, on a year-over-year basis. It does take an enormous amount of time to kind of investigate and follow up on these. And, for organizations that are targeted, by these attacks, it's just kind of a reality of being in that space that we'll talk about that. And then wire fraud, again, we have a small percentage of these attacks that are successful year over year. And in the next slides, we'll talk about some techniques for helping to protect against that. So in terms of some trends that we can now start to see, not just anecdotally, but looking at the data, is that, overall cybersecurity incidents are on the rise in general. I think spam continues to be a problem, but business email compromise is certainly the biggest headache that organizations face. And I would say account compromise is still at a high level, and I think this trend will continue, especially as more and more organizations are, working remotely. Maybe they're making some policy changes to make systems more accessible from people working from home instead of working from the office. And so I think some of those changes are going to lead to more account compromises being identified because, organizations are maybe loosening some of the security restrictions that govern, when and where people can access information from. So I think these are the trends that we're seeing, throughout 2019 and now into, now that we're into the first quarter of 2020. So I've alluded to a little bit of sector differences. And so we'll talk about that here. I think things like spam and business email compromise attacks, affect all organizations. Nobody's particularly immune from getting them. All organizations have, personally identifiable information about their employees, social security numbers. All organizations have some financial, assets, and, you can be swindled into buying a $500 gift card, no matter what organizations you work with. So again, I think those attacks seem to be applicable to, any organization. We do see that, policy or think tank organizations or organizations that are related to kind of good governance or, kind of democracy are targeted by those advanced persistent threat actors. So if you are in that space, if you're a policy group or, kind of think tank, these, foreign actors, Chinese, North Korean, Russian state actors are very interested in kind of the policy that is being formulated, the people that you're engaging with, And so those organizations have a tremendous amount of focus brought on them by these advanced persistent threat actors that have the resources and are really focused on breaking into the networks and just kind of maintaining their connection there. So I think if you're in that category, you've certainly got a bigger bullseye on your back than some other organizations. And then finally, I would say, based on our data, I would say social service organizations do seem to be more susceptible to business email compromise. That would be kind of the result of somebody sending that email spoofing the executive director or finance director, or asking somebody for credentials or sharing information. And I would venture to guess that that's largely due to lack of investment in training in security awareness training, perhaps a lower level of tech savviness on behalf of the users. So I think that's, again, something to be aware of. Again, if you're in that social service or kind of helping professions, we do tend to see more attacks being successful in those in that classification of organizations. So with all this bad news that's out there, what are the things that you should be focusing on? I will say, we do have a cybersecurity playbook that will be, that we have available that, has a much more comprehensive list of security controls that you can establish. And so I think that's a worthwhile resource to kind of go through and evaluate and make sure that you're following that roadmap. But if you just have to get started, I think these are kind of the absolute core essential tasks that need to be implemented for any organization. And the number one thing is implement security awareness training. Having an educated and aware staff, you're going to get a lot of benefit out of that. Security awareness training is not that expensive to implement. We use KnowBe4. It's a fantastic online platform. It's very affordable. You can implement it. There's lots of flexibility in terms of the education that's available. You can test staff. You can really get a sense of the progress that organizations are making. So again, investing in that area pays tremendous dividends. And so I would recommend implementing a security awareness training program as soon as you can, because it kind of covers protection against so many different areas. I think once you've done that, I do think it's worth getting a dedicated tool to protect your staff from business email compromise. We use Barracuda Sentinel, and it's been very effective. It does business email compromise or spear phishing protection, along with account takeover protection, DKIM, DMARC management and administration, and it's really fantastic. I think other vendors, Proofpoint and some others, also do similar things. But I think the point is, you kind of need something other than your regular spam filter to help protect staff against these types of threats. So business email compromise, because again, it kind of helps to eliminate the biggest pain point that staff have when they kind of see that that email that appears to be coming from the executive director. And then finally, implement multi-factor authentication. It's free. All the platforms have it baked in. And it's kind of the number one tool in your arsenal to protect your online identities from being compromised. And it's something that all accounts need to have in place, because the bad guys are going to attack the weakest link. And so if you've got 100 accounts and 99 have MFA on it, but one doesn't, that's the one that's going to get popped. So MFA needs to be universally applied for all accounts. No matter where, no matter who they are or where they're accessing the data from. So I think we're wrapping up here. So in terms of the things that we have capabilities in terms of cybersecurity at Community IT, we talked about security awareness training and policy. That's really informed by a NIST cybersecurity survey that we can perform. I've talked about that in previous webinars, and we'll see if we can get the link out to that. And then we have some offerings related to core cybersecurity assessments that provide, kind of a good overview of cybersecurity at an organization with some roadmap recommendations for organizations that really need a deep dive into their configuration and policy. We have what we call a comprehensive cybersecurity assessment that's rooted in the Center for Internet Security's 20 critical security controls. We have a range of managed cybersecurity services that we can provide. I talked about, security training, business email compromise protection, managed SOC services, kind of a whole long list of things. I have this on here as cyber liability insurance. So we are not a cyber liability insurance broker ourselves. We've certainly worked with a lot of organizations to help fill out applications. And I'll put a plug in for a course that will be coming out that I did in collaboration with TechSoup Courses. And that will be, an hour-long interactive course on cyber liability insurance, some of the ins and outs, the details. And so that'll be coming out soon. For right now, you can actually go to the TechSoup Courses page, and they actually have bundled together a number of their learning resources, including the Cybersecurity 101 and 201 course that I did. And they've actually bundled it into a free training bundle to help organizations that are making the shift to remote work. So I'd encourage you to go check that out, get into TechSoup Courses, sign up for the free remote work bundle, and then you'll be in the system and ready to go whenever the cyber liability insurance course comes out here in the next month or so. So then finally, we can do incident response as a way to to address after a breach has occurred. So again, we can have a range of those services for the organizations that we work with. So let's take a look at, I think the final slide here before we go into questions is, let's talk. We work with a wide range of organizations. Making sure that nonprofit organizations have good cybersecurity controls in place is something that is really important to me in the work that I do. As you said in the beginning, we use technology to help nonprofits advance their mission. So if you're worried about having account compromises, that distracts the focus away from what you're doing. So if you email cybersecurity at Community IT, I can actually provide a complimentary dark web scan to see what accounts may already be compromised. So again, that could be some insight if you're just trying to figure out what's going on with your network, or interested in kind of taking that initial step into tightening up some things, or you need something to show your executive director or leadership, like, hey, we need to take this more seriously. You can email cybersecurity at Community IT for access to a scan. I can return that pretty quickly. If you want to talk, you can book some time with me. Johan can chat out my meeting link. If you want to talk a little bit about some cybersecurity questions that you have at your organization. So I'm always happy to do that. So I think we are now at some time where we can have some Q&A. So I have been really focused on talking and have not watched the questions or chat at all. So Johan, what are some of the questions that have come in throughout the presentation?
Yeah, thank you so much, Matt. That was a great presentation, and it's exciting to see the results from this year's Cybersecurity Incident Report. There's been a ton of Q&A, and I've been responding to those as quickly as I can. I've also been chatting out a lot of the links that Matt had mentioned during the presentation. Those are also going to be available on our website, along with the slide deck, the recording of this webinar, as well as the transcript from the webinar. So that should be posted by the end of the week. And for anyone who's registered for today's webinar, you'll be getting a follow-up email with links to that information. So before we get to the Q&A, I did want to take a second to promote next month's webinar. Next month's webinar is going to be presented by our partners at Build Consulting. Build is an information strategy firm that specializes in nonprofit organizations. And they're going to be presenting next month on what nonprofits need from their tech leaders. Please note that next month's webinar will be on May 20th, which is, I believe, the third Wednesday of the month, but it will be at 1 o'clock instead of 3 o'clock. So it promises to be an exciting webinar, and I encourage you to register for it. And I want to thank everyone for joining the webinar today. We really appreciate your time and the opportunity to share these results with you. And now let's get into the Q&A. So please chat your questions in using the chat feature in GoToWebinar. And we also have some questions that were submitted prior to today's webinar during the registration period. So I think I might start there because there's a really interesting question that I'm curious to get your take on, Matt. And it involves security, obviously. If an organization has cloud accounts, Salesforce, Office 365, and they're using multi-factor authentication to protect those cloud accounts, and their staff are not using public Wi-Fi, I would presume they're connecting from home or from the office, should they layer on a VPN as well? Do they need a VPN in that scenario to use their cloud systems securely?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and I would say it may depend on kind of the overall security tolerance of the network, but I do think that we are going to see a shift from what's essentially open access to networks to a trusted device or trusted access model. You can kind of get example of this. If you just go into your Office 365 login, you'll just see thousands of failed login attempts against any account, and that's because you can access your account from anywhere. So I think we're going to start to see a shift from that kind of open model to a trusted device model, where you're saying like only this device that I'm going to register and approve is allowed to access these systems, as a way to kind of combat that. So I know in Office 365, I think in Salesforce as well, you can set up some IP filters. You can say we're only going to allow connections to the network from these IP ranges or this IP range. So I would probably look at that maybe as kind of a first step, as a way to minimize the surface area that's being attacked. So yeah, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to require a VPN. VPNs can add some additional overhead and complexity. So again, the final answer probably is it depends on kind of the organization's security tolerance. But I think I may even look at seeing if you could skip past kind of IP restrictions to just kind of moving to a trusted device model, where you're, instead of allow any device to connect and then allow those that successfully authenticate, I would say, we're probably going to move to a model where it's, only allow this trusted device to connect to the system.
Great. The next question involves a situation that we're probably all familiar with now, and certainly a situation that many nonprofit organizations are dealing with. What's the best way to ensure that home systems are secure? So if I think both, if staff have devices, computers that are managed by the organization, owned and managed by the organization, but also if nonprofit staff are using their home machines to connect to organization resources.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think the most important step that folks can take is to make sure that their computer is up to date. And so, that's either running updates for the Mac OS or Windows updates for Windows computers, to make sure that they have the most recent security patches. I know with all this shift to remote work and kids needing computers, people are like digging out stuff out of the closet. So again, if you've got, kind of old systems that are running, Windows XP or Windows 7, or older versions of Mac OS, that would not be my first choice, to kind of access work resources. So I'd say the first thing to do, make sure the system's up to date, just by running those updates, rebooting the computer a couple times to make sure that they've all been applied successfully. Windows 10, does include Windows Defender as a, Microsoft's antivirus, and it does an okay, it does an okay job of that. But really making sure that the system is up to date is kind of the number one thing that you can do to make sure that the system is actually secure, because a lot of these vulnerabilities, exploit kind of older unpatched operating systems. And so, making sure the system's up to date. That's number one thing. Make sure all those, the third-party plugins that you're using, make sure your Zoom is up to date. Make sure Chrome's up to date. Make sure Accurate Reader, all those third-party applications are up to date is really the most important thing that you can do to ensure the security of the device.
Great. All right. So next question: what are your thoughts about setting up a honeypot? And if you wouldn't mind defining that as well, I think that would be helpful.
Sure. So, like a honeypot is typically, kind of the terminology we define, like some kind of easy to access system or account that you would use to kind of trick or trap people into. Kind of a common technique would be, you would in the Windows world, maybe you'd like rename your domain admin account from administrator, and then you give it some complicated internal name, and then you would create an admin account and just give it guest permissions or even block it as a way to kind of throw would-be attackers, kind of off the scent of the organization. I mean, I think it's something that you kind of could do. I'd probably put it a little bit further down on the list of kind of techniques. I do think security is one of those, kind of a game of fundamentals. And so I would really make sure that for organizations, you've kind of covered all those bases before you kind of go down the road of like creating some more sophisticated kind of proactive security tool or kind of, proactive, kind of security techniques. So again, making sure all the systems are up to date, making sure that antivirus is in place, making sure that you're filtering all your web traffic, making sure that you're looking at all the system logs, making sure that you've got MFA in place, making sure that you've got cyber liability insurance in place, making sure that you've got monitoring and alerting configured. Like those are all things that I would do before I would do something like kind of setting up a honeypot to kind of trap or track attackers.
All right. Next question: any general sort of tips and suggestions for implementing multi-factor, which is something I know, Matt, that you've done quite a bit.
Yeah, I would say, and maybe actually we can dig it up, but we have actually a pretty good end user guide. This is for Office 365 for kind of the steps to take for implementing multi-factor authentication in Office 365. There's links. There's lots of great training resources available. Microsoft has a really great 3-minute video that actually walks through how to set up MFA on your personal device as an end user. So there's lots of great training resources available. I think the biggest things to keep in mind, from kind of the IT organization perspective that we run into is setting the expectations that, yes, you are going to have an app installed on your phone to make this, work. And I think, that's been, a place where we get some pushback. I think from a technology perspective, the MFA requirements are kind of easy to implement and easy to adopt. I think, kind of in general, people are more used to being required for a second factor. Now they have to have it to get into their bank or to get into, kind of other applications. So it's not as unusual as it was maybe 2 or 3 years ago. I would say take a look at the training resources that are out there. There's lots of good setup guides. Incorporating video as part of the training really helps, I think, to connect the dots for people when they're trying to figure out, like, what do I need to do with my phone in this specific context? And then again, set the expectation that, a smartphone really is required to make this work and work effectively in the most secure manner possible.
So I wanted to mention, before I go on to the next question, and this will probably be our last question, we do have a report that's sort of the companion to this webinar, and I'm going to send that link out. I just did. You can download it from our website, and we'll include that link in the follow-up email that we send out to all the attendees today. But just as a reminder, there is a report that includes all of the information we covered in today's webinar, and you can download that report from our website. So finally, a topical question. Are you seeing anything, Matt, as part of the COVID-19 pandemic and the stay-at-home orders that are in effect throughout most of the world right now? Have you noticed or seen any security impacts from that, aside from the Zoom situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think kind of Zoom, Zoom bombing, kind of people hacking into or causing havoc on Zoom meetings is probably the most common thing that we've kind of heard reports of. I do think that the shift to remote work has created some security holes related to remote access to servers in particular. So I know, there's a webinar that, I think TechSoup did that kind of talked about, RDP as a way to get access to servers and kind of talking about that. And so we've seen more open RDP ports kind of pop up. That is a pretty dangerous way to provide remote access because as soon as an RDP port is open, it's getting thousands of login attempts. And so, it's really important if you are providing remote access to servers that's done on, through the context of a remote desktop gateway, which basically proxies all of those connections through HTTPS, which makes it, more secure and less prone to those kind of brute force attacks. So again, we are seeing some more RDP access pop up, and we are trying to make sure that we are securing that remote access properly.
That's a great point. I hadn't thought of that. That's it's a big vulnerability and it's definitely something that people should be on the lookout for. Great. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Matt. This was a fantastic webinar, very interesting, a very important topic. And we thank all of you for joining us today. And we certainly wish that you would all stay safe and healthy during this time. And we hope you're able to join us for our webinar next month. Take care.